Good morning, everybody. My name is Muhammadu Mustafa Ali, Senior Fellow here at the Senior Economist here at the Policy Center for the New South. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here today with you, with our distinguished panelists today that I will introduce later on in a minute. Today, our discussion will be about economic and social development. Some might think or might be tempted to say that nothing new under the sky. We're talking about development since decades ago. But to those pessimists, I would say that a lot of changes, significant gains in the area of development are being secured in the new global south. 2 points allow me to stress that idea. The first point is that almost 5 years ago, the international community adopted the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. For the first time, the whole world agree on a unique set of 17 development objectives that should be the landmark around which all countries, developed and developing, should build their economic, social, and environmental policies. This was an important paradigm shift when we know that before that, we used to have development objective for African countries, for Latin America, for Asia, etc. But for the first time, the whole world is has unique objectives. And this is just showing that we now all accept that we are a really community of destiny. Community of destiny is being reinforced by what is happening now, the COVID-19 pandemics, since we have the coronavirus on one side and the other, we have the whole humanity fighting the coronavirus. This leads me to the second point, why we are entering in a new world. The second point is directly linked to the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, that arrives 10 years before 2030. We all know that at 2030, in 10 years' time, all countries should report the effort and the gain that have been made in the area of the SDGs. This pandemic also arrived at a special moment for all regions in the world, especially for Africa, which is now a very fertile area in terms of initiatives, programs, projects aimed at ensuring better life for African people. For example, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, the Agenda 2063. For the Mediterranean region, we have the Mediterranean Strategy for Sustainable Development 2016-2025. Taking account into all these disruptive events, the main question everybody is asking, what we are all wondering is, where do we stand today? In French, we would say, sur quel pied nous fait danser le COVID-19? To discuss all these ideas, it's a pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished panelists today. First of all, we have Madam Lande Araba. You are Managing Director for Africa at the Convergence Finance. Are you hearing me? Hello? Hello? Yes, if those who have their microphones on, they can switch it off. Yes, let me continue. We have Madam Lade Araba, who is Managing Director for Africa at Convergence Finance, a global network for blended finance, an important catalyzer for private investment for the developing world. You have also hold several senior positions in different organizations, the African Development Bank, in the UN system, the UNECA, and the FAO, and you have served as an advisor for the Nigerian Ministry of Finance. Welcome, Madam Lade, and many thanks for joining us. We have also Mr. Martin Boualia, a genuine product of African Union system. You are currently leading the industrialization division within the African Union Development Agency. You also co-chair the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. We have also, thank you for joining us today, Mr. Martin.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody.
Okay, thank you. We have also with us Mr. Mohamed El-Razaz, who is an expert, business development and employability at the Union for the Mediterranean. Currently, you are in charge of social, digital, and creative economy within the business development and employment division. Before that, you have an extensive experience in the financial sector in your home country, Egypt. Please welcome and happy to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, sir. Likewise.
Finally, we have Professor Landry Signé. Professor Signé is first of all Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. You are also Professor and Senior Advisor to the Chancellor on International Affairs at University of Alaska Anchorage. You have recently published a book named Unlocking Africa's Business Potential. On that book, I will just to summarize all your curriculum. I think what Mr. Mo Ibrahim, Dr. Mo Ibrahim said on your book summarize everything. Let me just allow to say some words taken from Mo Ibrahim's statement. What he says regarding your book is Landry Signé's seminal book, Unlocking Africa's Business Potential, remarkably outlines why African market could be at the top of the agenda for global business and entrepreneurs, and which strategies business and policymakers should adopt to improve governance of the economy and make business effectively contribute to Africa's economic transformation and sustainable and shared development. We are in debt to Professor Signé. So Landry, thank you and welcome home among yours, as we say.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So let me just start with the question for Madam Araba. You have a special interest for financing, development financing issues. So we have seen that, like regarding the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the financing issue is an important issue for developing worlds, especially for Africa also. The same issue, we have the same issue here regarding the SDGs for Africa, for African continent. For you, what are the funding options available for Africa in order to meet those SDGs, and what should be the right balance between private, public financing options, between internal and external financial options for the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Mohamedou. And I'd also like to express my thanks to the Policy Center for the New South for inviting me to this very important discussion this afternoon. As a starting point, like you mentioned in the introduction, I work with Convergence Finance, which is exclusively dedicated to blended finance, which is really just a financial structuring approach that leverages concessional capital, could be from public sources, could be from philanthropic sources, to de-risk transactions and make them attractive to private investors. Now, the reason why that is so important to your question is that if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, we have an annual funding gap of around $2.5 trillion. Africa actually accounts for 1.3 trillion of that annual funding gap. Traditionally, we have looked to public and philanthropic sources of funding. So when you think about official development assistance or even philanthropic grants that comes through foundations, you're looking on aggregate at around $200 billion. So obviously, those resources are simply insufficient to be able to close the significant funding gap on a global scale, but especially when you consider the fact that Africa accounts for, about half of the annual gap. Now, on the reverse side, if we look at the global capital markets, we're looking at value in excess of $200 trillion. Now, if we were able to get an allocation as small as 1.5% of the global capital markets and apply that to the Sustainable Development Goal projects, we would easily close that funding gap. Now, in principle, this sounds very easy. It's also helpful that in the last few years, a number of private investors have begun to adopt ESG guidelines into their investment thesis. So they're looking at environmental sustainability, they're looking at social or development impact, they're looking at strengthening governance. We have responsible investment principles that have been adopted. We also have investors who are now moving into impact investing specifically, where they're looking to generate an attractive risk-adjusted return or a modest risk-adjusted return, as well as the social development and environmental return. The challenge that they're having, though, is that we simply do not have a robust enough pipeline of investable opportunities. So even if a private investor wants to come in to Africa as an emerging market and is looking for opportunities to place significant amounts of capital that will ultimately contribute towards development, they still have a fundamental commercial mandate that they have to meet. They still need to, depending on what that mandate is, it could be to preserve capital, it could be capital appreciation, they might have certain return expectations depending on who their shareholders are. They might also have fiduciary responsibilities depending on the type of investor they are. And of course, there are also regulatory constraints. The global capital markets are regulated, and so there are a number of things that these various investors have to take into consideration when they are creating their investment portfolios. So the challenge really is not the lack of financing, is that we cannot find sufficiently well-structured and commercially viable transactions for these investors, both domestic and foreign, to place their capital into. So this is where blended finance becomes a valuable approach, because it's helping to improve the quality of that pipeline, to increase the number of investable opportunities, but also to create structures that investors recognize. If you want an investor to come into a risky market where you have a number of risks, could be political, we have a number of situations where there is political instability and uncertainty. You might have insurgencies within certain countries. You have currency risk, a lot of volatility in African currencies, which obviously are a risk to investors. We have limited levels of liquidity. So an investor comes in and they want to be able to exit their investment and not be, not have their investment stranded within that jurisdiction. And there are just a variety of other risks. So what blended finance does is basically to take concessional capital, to utilize it, and typically at Convergence, we talk about 4 blending archetypes. The most common, which is the one that we see in a large number of transactions, is where you have concessional capital within the capital structure. So what that means is, if you're lending, you're providing debt, it might be subordinate within the capital stack. You might have junior equity, and basically these are exposed to first losses. They're providing a layer of protection to investors. So if there are any losses in that transaction, that is the capital that becomes at risk, that might be lost. But it's necessary to do that to provide a layer of protection and comfort to investors. Another archetype that we see is credit enhancement, where you might have a guarantee that is provided. It could be provided by one of the multilateral development banks or even the DFIs, and basically, or even insurance products. And basically the point of this, again, is to strengthen the commercial viability of the underlying transaction. And there are many ways in which you can structure this. A third archetype is where technical assistance is applied. And we like to clarify that it can be utilized before, during, and after investment. And it can also be utilized to address specific market failures that might undermine the success or the viability of the transaction. It's not only about capacity building, although that can also be very important for the transaction. And then finally, grants. Grants can be utilized pre-investment to do project preparation, feasibility studies, market studies, build financial models, basically structure projects or get companies up and running so that ultimately you have something that is attractive to a private investor. Or grants can also be applied at the investment stage, where it's basically inserted into the capital structure as well to decrease the overall cost of capital. So there are many different ways in which you can apply concessional capital, but the point is we really need to focus on building more investment opportunities that are directly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals if we want to be able to attract private investment at scale and ensure that in the less than 10 years that we have, we're able to significantly close that funding gap so that by 2030, we are reporting that we have achieved these laudable goals.
Thank you very much, Madam Araba. Just when I hear you talking, I have just a question or something I want to make clear. Imagine that I'm an investor. Basically, what you're saying that is blended finance, private capital can be an pertinent opportunity to fund the SDGs. But we know that we have in a lot of social sectors, education, health, etc. How do you reconcile the returns from, for example, an investment in social sectors? We expect, for example, the returns in the very long term. It's different from in infrastructure or airport building or something like that, where we can have the returns in the midterm, 10, 15 years, etc. But building, for example, a school, we expect the returns 50 years later. How do you reconcile the two aspects of the things for private capital?
That's an excellent question, Mohamedou. And again, it really depends on the sector, but the type of investor that you're trying to pull in. So like I mentioned, there are different ways in which you can structure transactions. And I'll actually use an example from the health sector, because that's also a social sector. It can be very difficult to commercialize. So one of the things that Convergence does is to provide grants for innovative blended finance vehicles that have the potential for scale and replicability, that can be replicated. We've awarded about 6.2 million to 18 vehicles in the last 4 years. They have actually gone on to raise an additional $500 million, and they're gonna get to about 2 billion once they hit financial close. So we supported an initiative here in Kenya called Shift, which is supporting health invoice financing technology. And what Shift is doing is taking advantage of the asset-backed securities law that was passed in Kenya in 2017, where pharmaceutical distribution companies can basically securitize their accounts receivables in order to issue investment grade notes in the local capital market to bring in institutional investors. Now, what this is doing is it's increasing the flow of capital to the pharmaceutical sector. And in this ongoing pandemic, we've also seen them able to procure PPE and other equipment for health workers as a consequence of having access to financing, but also on improved terms. This is one way in which we have supported greater levels of private investment into healthcare. Obviously, they still haven't proven the concept, but there is potential here. Same with education. We have seen people structure development impact bonds that basically allow you to raise capital to be able to finance education. So there are different ways in which you can structure both social as well as more commercial type transactions. But the point is you have to ensure that they do have, they're well structured and that you're able to, pitch to investors on the basis of their own commercial mandates, the objectives that they have, and also the constraints within which they operate.
Thank you very much, Madam Araba. We might come back on this issue of financing. Thank you very much for this answer. Let me go to Ethiopia, perhaps, to discuss with Mr. Martin Bwalia. So, Mr. Bwalia, as we said earlier, I don't know if he's here. Okay. As we said earlier, Africa is nowadays is a region which is very fertile in terms of initiatives for development, programs, projects, etc. All those programs with the unique objective for better life for our population. But on the meantime, our founding fathers, almost 40 years ago in the Lagos Plan of Development, they warned us against the fact of having several plans, having several development plans, etc., with a lot of objectives. So my question is, in the context where we have the Agenda 2063, the SDGs 2030, how do you do to make all these initiatives coherent? Can we find common grounds for the Agenda 2063, the SDGs, etc., or is it completely different? Would it be possible to reconcile them or not?
Yes, thank you very much. And that is actually important. I hope you can hear me. What has happened, and this has been Agenda came earlier than the SDG. So when we came to implementation, the first thing we did in Africa was to make sure that the countries are not implementing two agendas. And that has been done both at political level with a decision of the African full alignment and coherency between the SDG, Agenda 2030. And that is a political decision. At technical level, we went further to look at the 7 aspirations of Agenda 2033, the 20 goals in Agenda 2033, and look at all the goals of Agenda of SDG, and actually aligned at both the levels of goals and targets. And actually we find that over 90% of that is very, very well aligned, is about the same thing. And what you recognize is that what is different is especially where in Agenda 2033, some elements that are very unique to Africa, like about Agenda 2033 and SDG are actually integrated into the UN, even the high-level platform there. You are not doing two works. You are actually doing one piece of work and can report to Agenda 2033, can report to SDG. And just to conclude on that, to underline that, when we look at this, for Africa, is the SDG that is in the 2033. The countries have to focus and ensure that within those goals, there's effort to create national wealth. And also ensure in Africa is important, as you may have seen, also the CFTA and others are looking at how do we increase Africa's own financing. And I'm also referring to what Madam Araba was saying. How do we build our capacity to ensure that the development financing is not a donor-aid program at, in all levels? That's number one.
Mr. Bwalia, we're not hearing you properly, so perhaps I might come back to you. We'll try to fix the connection issue and come back to you.
Is the human...
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Bwalia, there is just little issues regarding the connection, technical issues. So let me jump to...
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Perhaps let me just jump to, we're not, the line is not that clear with you. Let me jump to with Landry and come back to you right away. Hello?
Sorry, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. So go ahead. I think, hello? Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you now.
Okay. That concluded, I was saying that one thing we underlined in the alignment and coherence between SDG and Agenda 2033 was 4 impact areas or priority impact areas. This is about wealth creation. It's about human well-being. This is education, health, employment, food security, water security, all those elements. And number 3 is about human capital. Human capital and institutions is about the continent's capacity to manage its own economies. And the third one is to make sure that all this is driven in a space that respects environmental resilience. Over.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Martin. We will be back to you right away. Just the time to sort out the technical issues. So before I come to Landry, let's go to Spain. Hello, Mr. Errazaz. Thank you once again to join us.
Thank you.
Yes, we know that 5 out of 43 members of the Union for the Mediterranean are also members of the African Union. So we can find a lot of similarities, a lot of junctions. As in the 2063 agenda of the African Union, and for the African Union, employment, and for the, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, I won't hear. Okay, in the SDGs, employment for youth and women is also a special interest for the Union for the Mediterranean, especially in 2016. The Union launched the Mediterranean Strategy for Sustainable Development, dedicated to foster rapid attainment of the SDGs by the countries of the region. My question is, when we look at all the debates following this pandemic, a lot of European Union countries are now talking about reallocating industries that was located in the south of the Mediterranean. They are talking about reallocating those industries in Europe, in Central Europe. Is there, to your sense, a threat on employment and also on SDGs regarding this possible impact in the mid-term, long-term of the coronavirus pandemic?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for having me as one of the participants and the speakers to this conference, this webinar. We're very happy to collaborate with the Policy Center for the New South. Let me address your question in two parts. First, what the UFM is doing about employment, and second, what the opportunities are in the post-pandemic aftermath. So as you know, the Union for the Mediterranean is an intergovernmental organization that gives a new impetus to the 1995 Barcelona process, otherwise known as the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. And as such, this year, 2020, marks the 25th anniversary of this process. Now, the Union for the Mediterranean has two main pillars of action. One of them is human development, the other sustainable development, and obviously they are interrelated with the overarching view of creating an area of peace, stability, security, and prosperity for the region, and with a very clear mandate to work on promoting regional integration and cooperation. Having said that, unfortunately, the UFM region and Africa as well remain to be some of the least economically integrated regions in the whole world. I can give you some statistics when it comes, for example, to trade flows. Of all the trade flows that take place in the Euro-Mediterranean region, 90%, 90, is confined within the European Union. Another 9% flows between the European Union and its southern and eastern neighbors, and only 1% is south-south. So these are very drastic figures, but we also choose to see them as huge opportunity for further integration and for fully unleashing the potential. On employment, at the UFM, as you rightly said, youth, women, and vulnerable communities are at the crux of all our activities. In the current year, in addition to the Sustainable Development Strategy that you mentioned, we are in the final steps of concretizing our UFM youth strategy, which will streamline the youth dimension furthermore in all the activities done by the UFM and all the initiatives and the UFM labeled projects. Now, you mentioned employment, and here I would like to say what we're doing about it, and then I will talk about the opportunities and challenges that were brought by the global pandemic. First of all, I would like to highlight a very important flagship initiative that is project-based and cross-sectoral, called MED for Jobs, the Mediterranean Initiative for Jobs. It was launched in Tunisia in 2013, and it eventually became a pipeline of projects targeting youth, whether through job creation, through quality education, through skills development, through raising their employability prospects in the market. And so far, it has over 100 beneficiaries, direct and indirect, in the UFM region, the Euro-Mediterranean region, and it has benefited over 800 MSMEs. We believe in MSMEs as key vehicle for economic development and sustainable growth. Now, we believe that the youth do not only hold the keys to the future, but also to the present that we're living. Coming to the part on the post-pandemic and its repercussions on the region. we believe, or at least experience has taught us, that every global crisis, and we recognize that the COVID is more than just an economic crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis in the first place. But of course, it has its social, political, intellectual, and economic repercussions. When it comes to economic repercussions, we recognize, first of all, that the impact of the COVID will not be even across the world or even within different regions. Some countries are more vulnerable than others because of structural issues, because of more dependency on Chinese and Southeast Asian supply chains, because of other issues. And as such, some countries would be hit harder than others. But experience has taught us that with every global crisis, behind every such crisis, there lurks a once-in-a-decade golden opportunity. The very famous, if you may allow me, the very famous Roman orator, Seneca, once said that if a man does not know which port he is sailing, no wind is favorable. So this takes me to what Ms. Araba had mentioned about the need for investable opportunities, no? Because one thing is to spot the opportunity, another is to be in shape and equipped and mentalized to actually capture the opportunity. Between what we yearn to achieve and what we end up achieving is an ocean that many nations fail to cross. So it's in reality a plethora of factors, including political will, including economic agility, including a vision for the future, including the ability to build synergies and adopt a multi-stakeholder approach and adhere to flexible ad hoc frameworks of multilateralism and collaboration to the end of the long list. The opportunity that we see in short, following the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, there was much talk about the potential reallocation of some production processes and value chains and supply chains closer to home. Home here, because they were think tanks from Europe that were bringing up this idea. So home here was the Euro-Mediterranean region and its African dimension, of course. These talks are back on the table, and while this relocation might take the form of reshoring, in which these industries would go back to the country of origin, they can also, and more probably, take the form of proximization, meaning bringing these processes and value chains to Africa and to the MENA region, the Middle East. So we do see the opportunity. Of course, such a change will be gradual. It will not be overnight. And it will not be all over the board, because some strategic industries might be moved closer to home if the capacities exist. Some others, for very obvious economic reasons, might be kept for the time being, but there definitely is a clear opportunity for Africa to be on the right side of history at this very important moment in economic history, and capture these opportunities should the will and the vision and the capacities be available. Finally, I want to tell you that at the UFM Secretariat, we stand ready to accompany all the existing and the ongoing efforts in this regard, because we have it, as they say in Spanish, entre ceja y ceja, between our two eyebrows, to further consolidate regional integration. And we are currently in support with our strategic partners, producing our first progress report on regional integration in the UFM region, the findings of which will be presented later this year during the second half. So I thank you very much for the time that you made available for me, and I would be very glad to elaborate on any point. Please turn the mic on. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Razaz, for your very optimistic point of view. We really need it in this special time. Just a last question I wanted to ask: is there a kind of coordination or something like solidarity going on between the countries member of the UFM regarding the SDGs, etc., either in terms of funding, technical assistance, etc.?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this question, because in 2017, the UFM Ministers of Foreign Affairs in their meeting adopted a UFM roadmap for action. And this roadmap for action is totally anchored to our mandate, the Paris Declaration, and also to the Sustainable Development Goals as the global framework. The idea is not to duplicate the efforts or to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good effort done on the ground, and we want to accompany and synchronize and seek complementarities with our strategic partners and stakeholders. I think our multi-stakeholders approach is very conducive to this end. And actually, now that you've mentioned, our annual report for the Union for the Mediterranean that came out for the year 2019, for the first time, is actually organized around the Sustainable Development Goals. So they become not only an indication or a guideline, no, they become part and parcel and a guide to our professional and moral compass.
Thank you very much, Landry. Before I come to you, let me just go back to Martin. Martin, are you with me, Mr. Boaliam? Turn on your micro.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. So I think you stopped where you were telling us about 90% alignment between the SDGs and the A's 2063.
Yes.
So if you can just go, yeah.
Yes, I was saying that there actually has been very deliberate work to make sure alignment between the SDG and the Agenda 2033 at political level and at technical level. So at technical level, we looked at the goals, we looked at all the indicators, and realized that actually there was already massive alignment. That's where I mentioned the 90%. And I was saying that some of the differences are actually elements that are uniquely African, which don't necessarily concern the rest of the world, like the whole promotion of African culture and the elements of that nature. So we went further and looked at the implementation so that at country level, the countries actually don't get any perception that they are implementing two agendas. It's actually aligned and systematically developed so that when you are introducing SDG and Agenda 2033, that coherency comes up first and foremost. And all of them are then integrated into their national development plan. And this is important. The domestication into the national development plan is critical because that is where the ownership comes, and that's where the whole actual domestication and the framing within the context of the problems of the country is happening. And we went further to make sure that the reporting on those development objectives and goals is actually also consistent and is first and foremost done to inform the national development planning processes. And you can pick out of that report to the UN, you can pick out of that report to the African Union without necessarily duplicating work. And that is actually very fundamental.
Thank you very much, Martin. I will come back to you later. So let's go back to Washington with Landry. Landry, welcome home.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure to be back home.
Yeah, thank you. Unlocking Africa Business Potential. When we see the title of the book, yeah, it's okay. But to be honest with you, we are worried. We are worried because 2 years ago, we launched, the African Union launched the African Continental Free Trade Area with a lot of hopes, etc. Reticent countries finally signed. Almost all African countries has signed the agreements. But my inquietude is as follows. Are we obliged now to make a trade-off between policies to fight the pandemic, economic and sanitary policies, and the African Continental Free Trade Area? Are we obliged to hold the negotiations while we are fighting the pandemic? And should we expect negative or positive impact of this on the future negotiations for the African Continental Free Trade Area? We need you to really reassure us.
Yes. So thank you very much again. That is an extremely important question. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the critical importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area. As you mentioned, the CFTA, AFCFTA was adopted in March of 2018. A sufficient number of countries they have ratified by May 2019, and the coming into force was planned for July 2020. So I think that the significance of the CFTA could not be overstated. The fast speed, the largest trade area since the creation of the World Trade Organization in terms of numbers of countries. And as you have also seen at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, until July, most African countries did not have testing kits, for example. So many of the essential products, most of the African countries were also depending. Let's say that the pandemic has affected Africa in three ways. First, we have the exogenous impact, so the disruption of the global supply chain. Second, you also have the endogenous one, the disruption of local production among other, in addition of the healthcare challenges. And third, for the countries which are oil producers, we have seen that that was combined with an oil price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which has led to a drastic drop in the cost of the oil. So putting all this together, we can clearly see that without producing more, without developing a regional value chain, the continent will remain at risk. As a matter of fact, we estimate that about 53% of the countries which are responsible for about 53% of the export to Africa are the ones which are the most affected. Many of the countries, such as South Sudan, Angola, for example, are countries which primarily export to export more than 50. In the case of South Sudan, it's 95. In the case of Angola, over than 50% of their export directly go to China, for example. So you can see that when we have a disruption, both in terms of supply, but also in terms of demands, the continent is drastically affected. Another point which is very important is that when African countries trade with one another, they trade mostly manufactured product. So over 40% of the products which are manufactured. Although when they trade with the rest of the world, it is barely 17% of transformed product. So we can clearly see that here, that the crisis has highlighted the critical importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it is normal that on the short run, countries, African countries, like any other country in the world, have to focus on addressing the crisis, on the humanitarian question, on the health question. And on the medium and long run, they have to now accelerate the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I don't think that is either or. In the contrary, I think that the crisis demonstrates that without a development of a stronger continental industrial development, supply chain, and an increase self-reliance, I think the continent will remain at risk for the next pandemic. And perhaps just a quick point, especially for sub-Saharan Africa, less than 2% of the products, which are of the pharmaceutical products, are come from the continent. They are mostly imported. So we can clearly see that if the continent is not able to produce its own essential products, the continent will remain at risk if you have another disruption of the global value chain.
So if I hear you, for example, regarding the negotiation themselves, the negotiation, should we expect something that should resume, or would it, because it was expected on July. So what
Yes.
do we, what do you think? Will it be done remotely, or?
So I definitively think that the official launch of July should be postponed. There's a couple of things which are extremely important. First, launching officially, so even before the pandemic, the CFTA was speeding quite fast. And the reason why I believe the official launch should be postponed is that even the tariff concession schedule, many of the countries, including the one which have already ratified the agreement, have not yet submitted the tariff concession schedules. So, and in order to have a successful CFTA, we really need all the countries to take their responsibility and to do their homework. We really need the country to be ready. So I don't think that, of course, it is possible to launch the African Continental Free Trade Area as of July. However, all of us can count or can assess the level of exchanges. Why will we rush launching the African Continental Free Trade Area when we know that the pandemic has disrupted the operation of countries, reduced the level of resources available to accelerate the implementation? I think instead, the Secretariat, as well as the head of states and government, should instead commit to accelerate all the preliminary steps necessary for a successful implementation the minute the African Continental Free Trade will be launched. And coming from me, who is always encouraging the fastest speed possible for the implementation of African initiative, I think that if I'm saying, okay, now let's take a little bit more time to get ready, to ensure that country will be ready, so that when we start trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area, we are certain that it will be effective. This clearly means that it's better to delay. So that's the message that I will send to the head of state and government. And I think that is aligned also with what the Commissioner Ambassador Muchanga will believe, or what His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the new the first Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, will also be leaning towards.
Okay. Thank you very much, Landry. I'm sure that they are hearing you. So let me just go back to Martin. I don't know if you have something to add, but if no, we have a question for you. You can continue or take a question.
Yes, I can. Let me just add one thing. It's true that there is so much disruption on the process for the CFTA, but 2 points to add to that. Agreeing that there is need to make sure the minimum requirements for success are put in place. And that this is more than just an event or a signature of heads of state somewhere. There is work that has to be done at country level, and that should continue regardless. And as actually Prof was saying, the COVID-19 makes that even more imperative and more urgent. And I think that is part of the message, so that the message is not to distract based on the official platforms that have to happen, but that at national level, work should continue, should even be accelerated, and ensure that we have all the pieces we need to launch and operationalize the CFTA. That is one part. The other part is also to appreciate that the speed of the process has had some value at the political side in terms of that political momentum. And of course, from the beginning, we do know that there's a lot more work that has to be done at operational level, at the individual country readiness level, and all those things have to happen as we go on. And this is why encouraging the speed to go on, encouraging the political process to go on, is the appreciation that we will be even launching with, yes, some acceptable minimum conditions we need, but appreciating that a lot of things will still have to be done even after. So we're not going to get a perfect plan before we get into implementation, but actually get into implementation and continue to refine, continue to strengthen and adapt as necessary. Over.
Okay, so you are advising us to be more patient and more prudent regarding the African Continental Free Trade Area. So that's right. Because before I leave you, we have a question because from now we are receiving questions from the public because we are on live on Facebook and YouTube. Just Mr. Martin, regarding the informal sector that has been severely impacted by this COVID-19, what are how do you see the impact of the COVID-19 on the informal sector in the long run? Some analysts might see positive impact. For example, some countries like Togo, they are launching programs to register the informal sectors, etc. Perhaps we believe that at the end of this pandemic, those countries might have better information on the informal sector. Other analysts are very pessimistic. So I don't know, you at the African Union, at the NEPAD Commission, how do you see the informal sector in this particular context?
Thank you very much, and definitely an important issue. First is just to mention that as African Union Development Agency, in fact, we have developed what we're calling an African Union response strategy to the COVID-19, and this comes within the context of the whole African Union strategy to respond. Number one in that strategy is that we are saying in the COVID-19, there are disruptions, obviously, and we need to respond on the healthy front, healthcare front, and the socio-economic front. But we are also saying that there are actually opportunities that arise as a result of COVID-19. And some of these things relate to the fact that COVID-19 has exposed some of the critical, fundamental, structural weaknesses and fragilities that we have. Issues of inequality, issues of the financial systems, issues of economic structures that are actually inherently very weak and therefore making the continent extremely vulnerable to a pandemic of this nature or any other economic disruptions that we may have. Now, on the issue of informal sector, who are actually massively being impacted for various reasons. Actually, ILO tells us that 66% of our workforce is in the informal sector. So it's not a small and that most of these people would then be very vulnerable in terms of very low incomes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're hearing you. Go ahead.
Okay. In terms of low incomes, in terms of very structurally dairy income, so that if they don't get the income the next day, they actually don't have food. They can take children to school and all that. So what are we doing? Number one is actually like the example you've given in Togo, is to make sure that within the economic stimulus that the countries are undertaking, the issue of informal sector is not taken for granted. And we are saying that and be used to support the informal sector to remain afloat. But there has to be some work to customize, because circumstances are different from country to country, and therefore there has to be some effort to adapt these instruments and ensure that there are supports of remain to do that. Is not just in the interest of the informal sector, it's the interest of the whole country. Because if they collapse, you're talking about demand issues, you're talking about health problems even more. So it's in the interest of the whole country to make sure that the informal sector remain afloat. Number two is how do they emerge out of the COVID-19? So again, linking to even the more structural change, yes, registration is one them from being informal to being formal. But so how this
Mr. Martin, we're not hearing you.
Remain to be incomes in terms of life. Okay, it's better now?
Yeah, now it's better, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm saying that for informal sector is also more than just registering them or moving them from informal to formal, is actually a lot of work and may take time to, how do we, as the economy and the structure of the economy, ensure that the informal sector is actually strengthened to be able to support livelihoods, to be able to support the economy.
Hello? Yeah, Mr. Martin, we're not hearing you properly. So let me just, we'll be back to you.
That is that impresses. Yeah. So if it will. Okay.
Yes,
better?
okay. Yeah, slightly better, yes.
Yeah. So I was just concluding actually that the informal sector interventions is more than just to register them or to move them from being informal to being formal. Okay. It is actually massive, broad structural changes in the overall economy so that we provide for the livelihood needs of the population in the informal sector, that being in the informal sector, you can still have prosperity, you can still exist and meet all human well-being needs, but also how to increasingly provide for the informal sector contribution to the economy, including manufacturing, but also other services. So in short, I'm saying that what COVID-19 has done is expose the space of the informal sector, and we need to do more than just the welfare support in the immediate term, but how we can restructure that space and consolidate it so that it's able to offer better livelihoods for the people involved and continue to contribute to the economies in the countries.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Let's go back to Madam Araba. We have questions arriving from the public. So one question is asking the role big countries, big economies in the African continent should play, because we are in a time where we should not expect everything from outside or even from the private sector. What big countries could play in terms of funding, technical assistance, solidarity with other countries. For example, if I take the example of Nigeria, not everybody knows it, but Nigeria gives official development assistance through the African Development Fund. It's a trust fund inside the African Development Bank. So what kind of role, action those countries could play to help other lagging countries?
Certainly. Thank you, Mohamedou. I think that's a very interesting and important question as well. When we think about, trade areas that have been set up in other regions, and if I look specifically at Latin America, at Mercosur, which is a common market for Southern Latin America, it includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Obviously, Brazil and Argentina are the giants within that particular FTA. And what they have is actually a structural convergence fund where most of the funding comes from the larger economies. Paraguay and Uruguay put in a nominal 1%, and basically they're able to fund projects, infrastructure projects, as an example, across those 4 countries, but focused really on Uruguay and Paraguay, who are smaller and weaker economies than the other 2. I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from that when we're thinking about Africa and even implementing the Continental Free Trade Area. One of the things that has already been done is at the regional level is basically the Program for Infrastructure Development, where countries have defined a series of projects that need to be developed across the region to facilitate the movement of people and goods. And I think that, as we're talking about responding to the ongoing pandemic and even wanting to fast track the launch of the CFTA, we really shouldn't lose sight of the importance of these regional projects that have already been identified. There are commitments for some of the funding, especially around project preparation, by a number of the regional bodies. So if you think about, SADC, EAC, ECOWAS, they already have funds that are pulled together that are supposed to be utilized for project preparation. Now, if we take this in addition to maybe more specific structural convergence funds, similar to what I've described in Latin America, then we probably have more funding available that can both address the humanitarian and the emergency situation caused by the ongoing pandemic, but at the same time, not slowing the brakes on implementing these other regional projects. It's fantastic to have an agreement signed and ratified. It's great that we are harmonizing legal and regulatory frameworks, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the supporting hard infrastructure for people to be able to trade, then you're really not going to be able to maximize what the CFTA is supposed to accomplish. And I think another important thing that we need to learn and focus on, especially when we think about other regions that are commensurate or comparable with us, is manufacturing. If you think about, the Asian tigers or even the Southeast Asian countries, what they did really well was, one, they built their capacity, so skills, technology, but then they also established manufacturing hubs, industrial parks, and basically brought together all of the factors of production that are required to really drive manufacturing that is ultimately going to help to increase job creation significantly, increase incomes, livelihoods, and basically have other positive spillover effects, create positive externalities across the economy. I think that we should also be thinking about some of these things. And obviously, the larger countries have that strength, the economic strength to be able to do that, and they can certainly help the smaller countries. But I do think that, we need to be thinking about creating these hubs, industrial parks, but we certainly need the underlying infrastructure, and we do need to invest in the skills and technology.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Madam Araba. So, Mr. El Razaz, a question arriving from our followers. The question says, are the SDGs a priority for some of the UFM member countries, when we know that they are all engaged in the fight of against the pandemic? If you look at all countries like Morocco or even other countries in Europe, they are engaging a lot of resources to fight the COVID pandemic. So, do the SDGs a priority? Is the SDGs priority for African countries during these times, or should we put it on standby until we finish the fight, and after we come back to it?
I have 3 comments on this question. First, you mentioned Morocco. I personally believe that Morocco particularly is doing a fantastic job. They have been very proactive and very prompt and very transparent about this crisis since day one. I think they are a best practice that we can all look at. I believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are something that we should never lose sight of, because it's a frame of reference. We are talking about humanitarian, about social, about economic goals. All the efforts that are taking place now towards a post-pandemic recovery are anchored to these very same goals. So I don't believe that the Sustainable Development Goals should be sidelined or marginalized or put on hold until the crisis is over. On the contrary, the crisis has shown just how much of a deficit we have on the path that we need to all be following towards the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the UFM, you mentioned that countries are fighting and are struggling. Of course they are. And there has been a lot of talk about the lack of a coordinated approach. One thing I can tell you full-heartedly out of our experience at the Union for the Mediterranean is that regional and global challenges, they call for rational, regional, and global responses. Because the magnitude, the scale, and the scope of this calamity, of this challenge, is beyond the capacity of any individual country or organization to address. So more than any other time, again, allow me another quote, that on the conduct of each depends the fate of all. More than any other time, this holds true. We have been firm believers in this since day one, and this is why we have been working very hard, never losing sight of our goal of promoting regional integration to be able to make a common front to this challenge.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Erazaz. Let me go to Washington DC. So Landry, a question for you is asking, do you see similar progress for African cooperation that would emulate the European Union? Is it a model to aspire to post-free trade area?
Yeah, thank you. That is an extremely important question. And perhaps before coming to the question related to the SDGs, and I totally agree with Mohammed. So the countries which are fighting the COVID-19 pandemic are in fact contributing to progressing toward the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Speak about health, speak about poverty, hunger, decent work, and economic growth, industry, clean water. So it is not either or. So the primary responsibility of the countries is definitively to address the SDGs at home, and then to also partner in solidarity to achieve the goals globally. So I think that is a point which is extremely important, and thank you very much, Mohammed, for making it clear. So coming to the progress in terms of cooperation, let me tell you, I have been involved in negotiation, or at least in training some of the negotiators from Africa here in Washington, DC, including prior to AGOA Summit. So I can tell you that I have never seen, I myself was impressed and pleasantly surprised. I have never seen the level of convergence that I saw here in Washington, DC, when the African group was negotiating with the American, speaking with one voice. So I definitely, of course, the negotiations are complex, and different countries also have different interests which have to be conciliated. However, the fact that African countries came together and decided to work together, even if not all of them did agree at the beginning, even if they had divergent perspectives. At the beginning of the negotiation related to the African Continental Free Trade Area, the United States official position was one of not being enthusiastic about engaging with the continent at a continental level in terms of trade. 2 years after, and we have engaged multiple times with them, I have, including briefing top official in the US or testifying in front of the United States International Trade Commission. As a result, 2 years after, the United States has issued statement officially supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area and committing to deal and to engage, because African countries came together and they say clearly, although you are encouraging Africa to take ownership of its own destiny, now we are proposing you how we want to engage and why will you challenge this perspective. So we can clearly see that when African countries come together, even if within the group they still have some challenges to address, their ability to influence the relation with their partners is definitively different. And now, will we follow or not the European Union? I think African leaders have so many bright minds like you, Muhammadu and Martin, so everyone, so to create their own road. And I think you were speaking also about the program for infrastructure development in Africa, my dear sister. And I totally agree with you. It's extremely important for Africa to develop its own voice and to present it, engage with the rest of the world in its own terms, of course, in partnership with the rest of the world. Many of those elements, or some of the key trends related to the transformation that we see on the continent, as well as the opportunity in more than 8 sectors, are discussed in my book, Unlocking Africa's Business Potential, which was just released on April 28th. So, but yes, definitively, I think that there is no better time to be African, to be an African scholar, to be an African policymaker, and we just have to act effectively with accountability.
Thank you very much, Landry, for this very interesting point. So, Madam Araba, there is a question here for you. The question says basically Africa has somehow succeeded in attracting big foreign direct investment. Africa has become a hub for foreign capital. But what about small entrepreneurs? What is being doing for them, for from the public sector, private sector? What is being do we have them in mind? Do we keep them in mind, the small entrepreneurs?
Certainly. I think that we all know what the data says. The statistics do point to the fact that micro, small, and medium enterprises are basically the custodians for job creation across the region, and that there is definitely a lot of scope to formalize them, build their capacity. When we look at the data that we have at Convergence, which specifically identifies investments into blended finance vehicles that, some will be funds that will ultimately then invest in these SMEs, we find that they actually account for a significant percentage of the financing that is coming in. So when you think about, broadly speaking, the sectors where most of the investments into blended vehicles are happening in Africa, it's financial services, which includes microfinance and other type of access to finance initiatives and programs, and also energy access and climate finance related to that. When you think specifically within financial services, we also see that a significant percentage of the investments are actually going towards MSMEs. So they ultimately are the capital beneficiaries. Now, obviously, given the scale and the requirement for financing, there's still scope to increase the amount of capital considerably. And some of the things that we need to do, I alluded to earlier, is really build their capacity. We need better structured companies. We need companies that operate very formally, that are transparent. They have governance structures in place. They have internal controls. They understand about, bookkeeping, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the ways in which technical assistance can actually be beneficial to these companies. We also see that there has been funding provided to accelerators, and the job of accelerators is to help them become investable. So there's a lot of activity that is also happening there. A lot of it is donor funded, but we're also seeing national initiatives with domestic capital that is basically helping these MSMEs to strengthen their capacity so that ultimately, they are investor ready, but importantly, they're able to continue to grow and to create jobs and to contribute to the local economy.
Okay, great. That's clear. Thank you for this point. So, Mr. Martin, let's come back to you. You hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'll switch off the video just for to make sure my sound is clear.
Yes. So here the question is, the pandemic has shown the importance of strengthening multilateral cooperation, governance, and above all global solidarity. How can we achieve this inside the continent first and in a more broad perspective?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think my colleagues have already alluded to some of the elements that are important in this aspect. First is that even on the continent, as actually the pandemic has evolved, in fact, quite quickly from early March, the continent, the African Union Commission was already taking steps to make sure that there was not just individual country responses, but that the regions, the regional economic communities, and the continent as a whole is also reflecting on those collective decision points. And as we speak now, actually through President Ramaphosa of South Africa, there is actually a continental response strategy, which is looking at both immediate issues in terms of healthcare, the procurement of medical supplies, and all that through the CDC. There has been mobilization of financing to support those weak countries, and I mean that in good term, weak in terms of just immediate ability to provide for the needs, especially on the healthcare side. President Ramaphosa has appointed a task team of 4 prominent persons to look at more investment and financing issues, both in the short term, but even more so medium to long term. So the issue is that, and the point I'm making is that within the continent, the African Union has actually taken up steps to make sure that there are institutional arrangements that can allow the continent to work together collectively and respond to issues of this nature. You may be aware that, in fact, at regional economic community level, most of them, ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community, IGAD, have had, even to the level of heads of state summits that have happened within the last 2 months, looking at those collective efforts to respond to COVID-19. And that has resolved some issues. Some countries actually in the initial stages were even closing borders, also restricting some of the import-exports issues, and those things are being addressed actually in those collective efforts. That is one. The second point I want to make in terms of linking up then with the rest of the world is that what we've learned in Africa, and it has been part of the African Union reforms that was led by President Kagame, is integral part of why we are moving on the CFTA. We're going to move actually aggressively on industrialization as well, is that we need to be strong as a continent. There has to be an African narrative that we all buy in, that we all support, that we all can die for for us to then be able to engage and participate in the global affairs in terms of global politics. And this is a massive thing because it's changing the narrative from Africa going in the global space as a victim, as a charity case, but actually being able to participate and contribute and be able to actually say, this is what we can bring to that continental space. And these are things that look like in the background, but they are important, and our heads of state are getting increasingly committed on that and appreciating that it's not just about begging and looking for support from elsewhere, but it's about finding collective, global solutions to a thing that affects Africa as much as it affects the rest of the world. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Yeah, perhaps last three questions. Let's go back to Spain. So, Mr. El Razaz, we wanted to know at the UFM, is there an agenda to kind of amend the SDGs in the indicators, some of the indicators of the SDGs? For example, there is an ongoing research here at the Policy Center and in other research centers to play for a change in the indicators, in key indicators inside the SDGs. For example, when we look at SDG 3, some indicators has been proposed to take into account resilience, etc. So my question is whether this debate has arrived at the UFM, yes or no, or you will just keep on the indicators you have until 2030?
Well, this has two dimensions. One of them is the fact that we are mandated by the member states. So as such, we have not received any indications to elaborate any proposal for changing an SDG. It remains to be our framework of reference globally to which we anchor our activities. What we are focused on at this moment in time is contributing to the post-pandemic recovery. And we have been successfully able to tailor all the work program for the remaining part of the year, in addition to having that in mind as we plan the work program for 2021, to make sure that our activities are fine-tuned towards this recovery. So we are focusing on sectors that are promising, that are resilient, on business models that have proved to be robust during or in the wake of the 2008-2009 economic crisis. And we're also focused on this first exercise of gauging the level of regional integration and the areas of deficit and gaps whereby we can act upon. But to change the SDGs, it's not on the table at the moment as we speak.
Very clear. Thank you very much. So Landry, a question for you. I think you have already given some indication for this question, but as we say in French, la répétition est pédagogique. As African countries don't trade enough to each other, do you think that there are critical steps before reaching the FTA? For example, the structural change of countries and the whole continent.
So yeah, that is, as I mentioned before, there are many factors which are extremely important. I think Lade also mentioned the critical importance of infrastructure. So there are many barriers to trade, and not just trade, you also have the level of industrialization. So many scholars, in fact, have considered that Africa is deindustrializing, but at the Brookings Institution, and just to mention, I think at the beginning, I left, in fact, the University of Alaska Anchorage. I'm now also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and also a full professor and co-director of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 initiative with the Thunderbird School of Global Management. So at Brookings, there's something that we call industries without smokestacks. So when we look at those industries, export in those industries have grown 6 times faster from 1998 to 2015 than export in traditional manufacturing. So those include ICT-based services, but also horticulture, among others, and of course, an area which is now very affected by COVID-19, tourism. But one thing which is extremely important with those industries is the connection or the similar characteristics that they will have with traditional manufacturing. You have tradability and exportability. They are labor intensive, which means that the ability to absorb a high quantity of moderately skilled workers. And you also have the high productivity overall in this industry. So it's very important when we speak about the African narrative to understand that we should be speaking about the African narratives. So we have many stories of growth, of industrial development, among others. And perhaps a straightforward answer to your question is it is not either or. So both should evolve simultaneously. While countries have to address the challenges to manufacturing, industrial development, including improving the business environment, reducing the cost for doing business, developing infrastructure, ensuring that it's not a labor skill mismatch among other factors. They also have to build the condition for accelerated trade, so which will facilitate, among other, the constitution of a sub-regional or continental global value chain among other factors. So it's really important for a leader to make progress simultaneously. And I think that the African Union Development Agencies is also doing an incredible work to advance some of those strategies along with other partners. It's also one of the core goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area, because in order to trade, you have to produce. But the good news, as I also mentioned, is that when African countries trade with each other, so they trade mostly manufactured products. So which means that increasing trade will also contribute to accelerate industrial development and create jobs.
Okay, thank you very much, Landry. I will ask a last question, a unique question for all of you. And while you will answering the question, you will give us your last words to finish this session. The question is, are SDGs in equal terms of implementation between the North and the South? So perhaps we start with Landry, as you appearing on my
yes
on my screens, and your last word also.
So the question, if I understood well, is to whether the SDGs are equal in implementation in the North or in the South.
Okay. Yeah.
So let me be clear. The SDGs are related to all the countries. In the US, for example, we still have people who are suffering hunger. We have a high level of poverty. We have people who cannot afford to go to the hospital when they are sick. In some regions, like or in some states, like Alaska, for example, you have people who do not have access, especially in rural areas, to running clean water or to electricity. So when we speak about the SDGs, we often discuss the challenges faced by emerging economy or developing countries. But I think that if you look at the progression, so I would probably have to look at the statistics before saying that, but if you just look at the progression, of course, it's easier to move faster when you start lower. So it will not be surprising to see that the countries which are making more progress are probably the ones who were also at a lower level for most of the indicators related to poverty, health, education, among others. However, some of my colleagues, including here at the Brookings Institution, have also conducted some work on the implementation of the SDGs, including in Canada, and many are very concerned. So we are all involved in this fight to achieve global development and the sustainable development goals. And I think that we should make sure that countries, that the citizens in the developed countries are neither left behind, or even something that another colleague has also done about the region left behind. So including in the US or in Canada, in France, in many other countries, advanced economies, you will see that many citizens, but also region, are left behind. So it is a global, those are global goals. And if you just look at the progression, many developing economies will be proud of the progress, but still in absolute numbers, it's also there where more work is needed.
Oh, thank you very much, Landry. So Mr. El Razaz, your last word and your point on the question.
Well, by nature, there is a disparity. I don't want to call it a variable geometry, but we do recognize the disparity in the pace and the will of abiding by and realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not necessarily about political will, it's also about capacities, it's about rhythm, it's about working culture, it's about the economic structure, it's about many things, where the country is located in the economic cycle or on its development curve. It really, to us at least, it's like comparing apples and oranges. Countries have different capacities, different working cultures, different circumstances, and as such, the pace is different. And it's not to say that countries are lagging behind or others are ahead because they are doing better or doing worse. It's just the reality, the way it is on the ground. And what we can do is try to take stock of the situation on the ground, accompany the efforts that already exist, and help the countries lagging behind to make the leap and join the ranks of the countries that are ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Razaz. Thank you. Martin?
Thank you.
Your last point.
Yes, and I'll switch off the video again, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 quick points on the question. I think it's both like Mohammed and Landry have said. One, the North-South issue is probably well covered. But the thing I would highlight is that even when you come within Africa, our diversity is so wide, so huge, and therefore you are not bringing the SDG or Agenda 2033 as a kind of solution for everybody. It's a development framework. And one of the things we need to do, we actually do, as I mentioned earlier, is to domesticate, because of those, you have to put it within the circumstances of the country. And it's true actually that in some of the ways, it doesn't also help so much to compare the countries, because they will be coming from different angles, they will be at different rates, and appreciating that is important part of, in fact, succeeding with the countries in advancing the SDG. That is to the question. Now, in terms of my concluding remarks, just 2 or 3 points. Number one is actually in the continent, there is growing appreciation of the fact that COVID-19 is not just a small bubble that will happen now and disappear, but is something that in itself, and especially in terms of the consequences and its implications, we are going to have to live with for a long time to come, even in terms of whether you're talking about recovery or rebuilding or sustaining and going beyond where we were before COVID-19. Number two, you asked a question about should we change some indicators in there. In fact, our position is that it's not so much about the indicators, it's a process that should start from the countries and support the countries to adapt, to review the strategies, to review policies, to review the national level instruments that they have put in place to move towards those goals of Agenda 2030 of SDG, and in there, support them to say, do we go back to the same pathways or even better beyond the pathways they were before COVID-19? And in there, you're going to see how realistic, or does it still remain realistic to advance at the rate in terms of milestones that we set up before COVID-19. So the point I'm making here is that we shouldn't so much start from the top. It may be just academic, but start with the countries and support them in terms of adapting their tools to move on the SDG Agenda 2030, taking into account the disruptions from COVID-19. And the last point is that in terms of the efforts being made at all levels, you did mention the issue of informal sector. So we want to recognize the fact that in general, globally, Africa is coming from a very disadvantaged point in many aspects. And of course, we know I am not going into that. But therefore, some of the big issues that relate and have been highlighted by COVID-19, like the issue of debt, the issue of safety nets, the debt issue related to the financing that Madam spoke to earlier. But the whole issue of governance actually needs to be in a very systematic, and this is also where institutions like the Brookings, like the UFM, can actually help so that we are getting some organized, systematic interaction in a comprehensive way to support the countries deal with this, and not floating from one issue to the other and actually getting all things mixed up, and even to the extent that maybe you get solutions that are completely out of context for some countries. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. So, Madam Lade Araba, your last word and answer to the question.
Thank you very much, Mohamedou. I think that when you consider North-South implementation of the SDGs, it's really challenging to make that type of comparison because you're talking about jurisdictions where there's a very solid baseline and others where they haven't even succeeded in creating a baseline yet. So it becomes very challenging to answer that question from a comparative perspective. What I think is important is for each country to determine what its baseline is and basically to focus on achieving the goals for itself based on its current realities. I think that that's really where I would say the focus should lie. And then also, when you think about some of the SDGs, and I'm gonna pick SDG 5 that talks about women, I think equality, inclusiveness is a global issue. There are a few countries in Europe that are advanced in that area, but pretty much the rest of the world, and even here in Africa, we're not seeing as much traction with regards to gender equality and inclusiveness. And I think that that is something that where we need to shed light, because it's not just about ticking a box that we have a woman on this panel discussion. It's really about, you know, the other positive externalities that are created when you invest in creating equality and inclusiveness. So I thought that I would mention that as well. My final thoughts as we wrap up this very interesting conversation this afternoon is that, you know, one of the things that I feel this global pandemic is really forcing us to do is to focus on building systems. We're oftentimes operating from a short-term perspective where we are responding to crises, and crises come in cycles. I think we're starting to see a shorter lead time between cycles, but crises come. And we're reacting to these crises, but we really need to be building systems to make our countries resilient and anti-fragile. So the next pandemic that comes shouldn't catch us by surprise. We should have invested significantly in the health systems. We should have, better quality care. We should have primary care that is available outside of the urban areas. We need to really focus on building these systems so that when these crises come, they're not going to wipe away gains that we have achieved in other areas. And that's really where I would say that, a lot of the effort needs to focus on moving forward.
Okay, so thank you very much, Madam Lade Araba. Thank you, Mr. Martin Boualia. Thank you, Mr. Mohamed El Razaz, and thank you also to Landry for this discussion. We hope that while we are obliged to end this live, perhaps the discussion will keep going on between all of us individually, as experts, as development specialists, and also between institutions. We have together today two important institutions in the African region, the UFM and the NEPAD Commission. So we hope that the reflection will continue. It was a real pleasure and an honor to have you all here. So thank you very much for accepting to be here today. And next time, see you next time. We hope that not next to COVID, but next time in a more happiest circumstances. So thank you for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.